So in this video, we are going to talk about music history. And I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. This is going to be stuff that we're going to discuss in more detail in lessons and possibly in future videos. But this is just meant to give you a basic overview of what the four periods of classical music history are, and their time periods and a couple different composers that you might recognize from each one and their characteristics. Again, I'm not expecting you to memorize this all at once. This is basically meant to give you some exposure to these ideas, so that when I see you in lessons, we will be able to discuss them and you'll have some idea of what I'm talking about. So the earliest period of music history that we're going to count is what we call the Baroque period. And that's roughly from 1600 to 1750. These are just approximate dates of how later historians have categorized them. This isn't an exact thing. During this period, some composers you might recognize are Bach, Handel, and Scarlatti. And these notes are kind of small, so you're probably not going to be able to see them all super well. But basically, some of the characteristics of music in the Baroque period is a lot of ornamentation is used, trills, things like that, which we'll discuss how to do again in lessons. What we call terraced dynamics, which came about because the piano had not been invented for the majority of the Baroque period, so a lot of these pieces are actually written for the keyboard instruments they did have, like harpsichord and organ. And on those pieces, changing dynamics is not as simple as it is on piano. Their pianos are very pressure sensitive, and so we can have things like crescendos and diminuendos where we can gradually change our dynamics. But those instruments did not have that, and so terrace dynamics were used. So it would be kind of like having one measure be piano, the next measure would be mezzo piano, and so forth, or the next group of measures. And that was how they did that. And then another thing that we call, another characteristic is what we call polyphonic texture. That's this word right here, polyphonic, where the melody is kind of passed between multiple voices. And I'll show you examples of what that looks like. But the melody is not always necessarily super clearly defined as being in right hand or left hand or anything like that. The next period is what we call the classical period. I'll let you look at that right there. So that is from 1750 to 1830, about. Some composers you might recognize are Haydn, Mozart, Clementi, and Beethoven. One characteristic is Alberti bass, and that, if we haven't already discussed that before, is basically a broken chord pattern in your left hand, because bass, obviously, that goes kind of low, high, middle, high, and it has kind of that basic pattern. We'll go over examples in the lesson. Homophonic texture, which basically is the exact opposite of what we see in Baroque music. In classical music in general, the melody is very clearly defined, and it tends to stay in one voice in a given section. And sonata form, which is the form used by sonatas, sonatinas. A sonatina is just a little sonata. Basically, it's kind of a modified ABA form. You have an introductory section, which is called the exposition, to expose you to the main theme. And then the development is kind of where things get interesting. The key might change around. It's kind of something completely different. The composer basically just does whatever they want there. And then the recapitulation, which plays kind of the same thing from the theme from the exposition and just wraps everything up. Next, we have the Romantic period, which is from 1830 to 1900. Some composers you might recognize are Schumann, Grieg, and Chopin, one of my favorite composers personally. Bach and Chopin are some of my favorites. Lots of really good pieces. Romantic music tends to be a little bit more emotional. A lot of the titles are meant to convey a little bit some more specific stories or ideas. The melodies are very lyrical, something that, is kind of singable, I guess is one way to put that. And the rhythms and the harmonies get a little bit more complicated than you see in a lot of classical and Baroque music. And the final period of music history, which technically we're kind of in right now, some people call it the contemporary period. It's really just 20 to 21st century. So 1900 to the present, which obviously 100 years ago, or 121 years ago, is not exactly contemporary. They just haven't really come up with a name for that yet. Some composers you might recognize are Bartok, Kabalevsky, and Prokofiev. A characteristic of 20 to 21st century music is atonality, which basically means that there's no distinct key. Music doesn't really stay in key. You don't have your nice 1-4, 5-7, 1 chord progressions necessarily. Things are just a little bit more chaotic, which makes for some very interesting sounds. Irregular meter, or meter that changes, so stuff that you don't commonly see in a lot of other periods, like 7-4 or 5-4 time signatures. However, polyphonic texture is also used. It's kind of like we've circled back around here. We started seeing a lot of that in Baroque music, and we see some of that in 20 to 21st century music. And stuff like sonata form is also used sometimes. And polytonality is another thing, which basically is the use of multiple keys at the same time. Again, we will look at examples of these in our music. This is just meant to be an overview, so if this feels like a ton of information, don't worry. This is stuff that you'll be able to know and understand as we go forward.